What happens when your sister steals your billionaire fiancé, but 5 years later at your dad's funeral, his real wife shows up? Trust me, you'll want to hear this story. Standing in this funeral home, surrounded by the scent of lilies and whispered condolences, I never imagined I'd be holding back a smile at my own father's memorial service. My name is Claire, and 5 years ago, my world fell apart when my billionaire fiancé Richard Langford suddenly broke off our engagement. What I didn't know then was that my own sister Emily had been planning to steal him from me all along. The mahogany casket in front of me holds more than just my father's body. It holds the last 5 years of my family's lies, manipulation, and betrayal. Because while I was rebuilding my shattered life in Denver, Emily was busy playing house with the man who was supposed to be my husband. She thought she'd won the ultimate prize. Richard's fortune, his penthouse, his private jets. She thought she'd gotten away with the perfect crime. But as I watch her walk through those chapel doors right now, draped in designer black and clinging to Richard's arm like she owns him, I can't help but think about the woman sitting 3 rows behind me. The woman Emily has no idea exists. The woman who's about to destroy everything Emily thinks she's built. You see, my sister made one crucial mistake. She never bothered to check if Richard was actually free to marry her. And today at our father's funeral, she's about to find out that some victories aren't victories at all. They're just borrowed time. She thought she won until today. But let me take you back to where this all began. 6 years ago, I was Professor Claire Harrison, 32 years old, teaching European history at Boston University. My life was quiet, predictable, and honestly, a little lonely. Then I met Richard Langford at a charity auction for historical preservation. He was this incredibly sophisticated man, 42, recently widowed, with this commanding presence that filled every room he entered. When he bid $50,000 on a rare Civil War manuscript just because I mentioned it was significant, I knew he was different. Richard was the CEO of Langford Technologies, worth over $2 billion, but what drew me to him wasn't his money. It was the way he listened when I talked about my research, how he remembered every detail about medieval tapestries and Byzantine art that I'd ramble about over dinner. Our relationship moved fast. Maybe too fast. Within 8 months, he was flying me to his estate in Martha's Vineyard on weekends, introducing me to his business partners as his serious girlfriend. I felt like Cinderella, but with a PhD and a passion for dusty old books. Then came the proposal. Richard flew me to Paris, to the same cathedral where Eleanor of Aquitaine was crowned. He got down on one knee right there in the nave and presented me with this stunning sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds. He said the sapphire reminded him of my eyes when I talked about history, how they lit up with this deep, brilliant blue. I said yes without hesitation. How could I not? This man had swept me off my feet and made me feel like the most important person in his world. Of course, I wanted to share this happiness with my family, so I brought Richard home to meet my parents and my younger sister Emily. Dad was impressed by Richard's business acumen. Mom loved his old-world manners. And Emily, well, Emily seemed fascinated by everything about him. Maybe I should have paid more attention to how fascinated she was, how she'd ask detailed questions about his work, his travels, his plans. How she'd laugh just a little too long at his jokes and find excuses to touch his arm when she talked to him. But I was in love, and love makes you blind to things you should see. I thought Emily was just being her usual social bubbly self. She'd always been the outgoing one, the charmer, while I was the bookworm who preferred libraries to parties. Richard seemed to enjoy the attention from my family. He'd bring expensive wines to dinner, tell stories about his business deals in Tokyo and London, and Emily would hang on every word. She'd ask him about his late wife, about his loneliness, about what he was looking for in a new relationship. I remember thinking how sweet it was that my sister cared so much about my happiness, how she wanted to make sure Richard was good enough for me. What I didn't realize was that she was conducting her own private interview for a position I thought was already filled. Then 3 months before our wedding, everything changed overnight. I'll never forget that Tuesday evening in March. Richard called me just as I was grading midterm exams in my office. His voice sounded different, distant like he was reading from a script. "Claire, we need to talk," he said. No warmth, no pet names, just cold formality. When he came over to my apartment that night, he wouldn't even sit down. He stood by the window looking out at the Boston skyline and delivered what felt like a rehearsed speech. "I need to focus entirely on restructuring the company right now. The board is pushing for major changes and I can't afford any distractions. I think we should postpone the wedding indefinitely." Postpone. That's the word he used. Not cancel, just postpone, like he was rescheduling a business meeting. I asked him what I'd done wrong, if there was someone else, if his feelings had changed. He kept repeating the same corporate buzzwords about focus and restructuring and fiduciary responsibility. It was like talking to a stranger wearing Richard's face. He left that night and took the engagement ring with him. Said it would be safer in his vault until we could revisit our situation. I spent the next 3 weeks calling him, texting him, showing up at his office building. His assistant would tell me he was in meetings, traveling unavailable. The man who used to call me 3 times a day suddenly couldn't spare 5 minutes for a conversation. I was devastated. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on my classes. My students started commenting on how distracted I seemed. My colleagues whispered in the hallways about Professor Harrison's broken engagement to that billionaire. The worst part was not understanding why. Richard had seemed so committed, so ready to build a life together. We'd already booked the venue, sent, saved the dates, chosen our honeymoon destination. And then suddenly, I wasn't worth his time anymore. My family tried to be supportive. Dad called Richard's behavior unacceptable for a man of his stature. Mom kept saying I was better off without someone so unreliable. And Emily, sweet Emily, was there for me every single day. She'd bring me soup when I couldn't get out of bed, listen to me cry about how much I missed him, and rage on my behalf about how cruelly he'd treated me. "You deserve so much better than him," she'd say, rubbing my back as I sobbed. "Any man who can throw away someone like you isn't worth your tears." What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares, was that Emily had been in contact with Richard throughout those 3 weeks of my heartbreak. While I was calling his office and getting rejected, Emily was getting cozy text messages. While I was crying myself to sleep, wondering what I'd done wrong, Emily was planning her first official date with my ex-fiancé. Just 2 months after Richard broke my heart with his corporate restructuring excuse, Emily was posting photos from Napa Valley with a mysterious new love she wouldn't name. 2 months. That's all the time she gave me to grieve before she started her new life with the man who was supposed to be my husband. I found out about Emily and Richard's marriage in the most humiliating way possible. Through social media. It was 8 months after my breakup and I was finally starting to heal. I'd thrown myself into my research, started dating a fellow professor named David, and was cautiously optimistic about moving forward. That's when my college roommate Sarah called me, her voice shaking. "Claire, you need to sit down. There's something on Instagram you need to see." Emily had posted a photo of herself in a stunning white Vera Wang gown standing next to Richard in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. The caption read, "Married my soulmate in the most intimate ceremony surrounded by family. Sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for." Worth waiting for. As if she'd been patiently waiting her turn instead of actively stealing him from me. But here's what made it even worse. The photo was tagged at the Langford estate in Martha's Vineyard, the same estate where Richard had taken me for romantic weekends. They'd gotten married in the same garden where he'd first told me he loved me. I called my parents immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. "Did you know?" I asked my mother. "Did you know Emily was dating Richard? Did you know about the wedding?" The silence on the other end told me everything. They'd all known. My entire family had watched Emily steal my fiancé and said nothing. "Sweetheart," Mom finally said, "we didn't know how to tell you. Emily made us promise not to say anything until she was ready. She said you were finally healing and she didn't want to set back your progress." Set back my progress. Like my sister marrying my ex-fiancé was just an inconvenient speed bump in my recovery. "How long?" I asked. How long have you all been lying to me? Dad got on the phone then. They've been together for about 6 months. Emily said Richard realized after your breakup that he'd made a mistake, that he'd fallen for the wrong sister. She said it was destiny. Destiny. That's what they were calling betrayal now. I hung up and immediately called Emily. She answered on the first ring like she'd been expecting my call. Claire, I can explain everything, she said, but her voice had this underlying tone of defiance, like she was prepared for a fight. She'd already decided she was going to win. You married him, I said. You married Richard and didn't even tell me. I wanted to tell you, but the timing was never right. You were so fragile after the breakup and then you started dating David, and I thought maybe it would be easier if you just moved on without having to deal with this complication. Complication. My sister had just called her marriage to my ex-fiancé a complication. Did you plan this? I asked. From the beginning, when I first brought him home, were you planning to steal him? Nobody stole anybody, Emily snapped, and there it was, the real Emily underneath all that fake concern. Richard chose me, Claire. He realized we had more in common, that I understood his world better than you ever could. You were always too academic, too in your own head. Richard needs someone who can match his social life, his business demands. Someone who can steal him while consoling his heartbroken ex-fiancé. Someone who doesn't make everything about dusty old books and dead historical figures. That's when I knew our relationship was over. Not just strained or complicated, but finished. The sister I'd grown up with, the one I'd shared secrets and dreams with, had looked at my happiness and decided she wanted it for herself. I packed my entire life in Boston within 2 weeks. I quit my position at the university, sold my apartment, and moved to Denver, where I'd been offered a position at the Museum of Nature and Science. I needed to be as far away from my family as possible. I stopped returning their calls, stopped responding to their texts. When Christmas came, I sent polite but distant cards. When birthdays arrived, I sent flowers with generic messages. I built a wall around my heart and refused to let any of them back in. The hardest part was cutting off my parents. They'd raised me, loved me, supported my dreams, but they'd also chosen Emily's happiness over mine. They'd watched her steal my life and called it destiny. For 3 years, I lived in that self-imposed exile. I threw myself into my work, made new friends, built a new life. I convinced myself I was better off without the drama, without the family that had betrayed me so casually. Then 4 months ago, Mom called with news that shattered my careful isolation. Dad had suffered a massive stroke and was in intensive care. The doctors weren't sure he'd make it through the night. I flew back to Boston on the next available flight, my heart breaking all over again. Not just for Dad's condition, but for all the time I'd lost, all the conversations we'd never had, all the forgiveness I'd withheld out of pride and pain. Dad survived that stroke, but it left him weakened, changed. The vibrant man who'd built his own construction company from nothing was now confined to a wheelchair, struggling to speak clearly, dependent on others for basic care. And through those 4 months of his decline, Emily barely visited. She was too busy with her new life, too occupied with Richard's social calendar, too important to spend time with a sick old man who could no longer contribute to her image of success. But let me tell you about the life I built in Denver, because it was in those 3 years of exile that I discovered who I really was, without my family's drama. The Denver Museum of Nature and Science offered me everything Boston University couldn't. I became the senior curator of historical artifacts, overseeing exhibitions that drew visitors from around the world. My specialty in medieval European history suddenly became relevant in ways I'd never imagined. I had my own office overlooking the Rocky Mountains, a team of researchers who respected my expertise, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly valued for my mind, rather than overlooked because I wasn't the social butterfly my sister was. That's where I met Ava Whitmore. She was the museum's new development director, tasked with securing major donations from wealthy patrons. Ava was everything I wasn't: confident, outgoing, effortlessly elegant. She had this way of making millionaires write six-figure checks while making them feel like they were getting the better deal. We became fast friends over late-night Chinese takeout while preparing for exhibitions. Ava had this infectious laugh and this ability to find humor in even the most stressful situations. She became the sister I wished I'd always had. One evening, about 2 years into our friendship, we were having wine at her penthouse apartment when she casually mentioned her family connections back east. "My cousin Isabella lives in London now," Ava said, swirling her Chardonnay. "She's been dealing with this messy situation with her estranged husband. The guy's a complete narcissist who's been stringing her along for years." I made some sympathetic comment about how difficult long-distance relationships could be. "Oh, it's not long distance," Ava laughed bitterly. "It's abandonment. This man married Isabella 8 years ago, then basically disappeared. Moved back to the States, started a whole new life. Acts like she doesn't exist. But he's never actually divorced her." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What's her husband's name?" "Richard Langford. Maybe you've heard of him. He's some big tech CEO in Boston." The wine glass slipped from my hand and shattered on Ava's marble floor. She jumped up, grabbing paper towels, asking if I was okay. But her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Claire, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Richard Langford," I whispered. "Ava, Richard Langford was my fiancé, the one who broke off our engagement and married my sister." Ava stopped cleaning up the wine and stared at me. "Your sister married Richard when—" "3 years ago, they had this intimate ceremony at his estate in Martha's Vineyard." "That's impossible," Ava said slowly. "Claire Richard is still legally married to Isabella. They never divorced. She's been trying to reach him for years, but his lawyers keep stalling." The room started spinning. Everything I thought I knew about Emily's fairy tale marriage was crumbling in real time. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I could see in Ava's eyes that she was absolutely certain. "Isabella has all the documentation, marriage certificate from their wedding in London, correspondence from lawyers' bank records showing shared assets. Richard Langford has been living as a bigamist for 3 years. Ava pulled out her phone and started scrolling through photos. "Look, here's Isabella at Christmas last year. She still wears her wedding ring because technically she's still Mrs. Richard Langford." The woman in the photo was breathtaking. Tall, elegant, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She looked exactly like the kind of sophisticated woman Richard would marry. She also looked nothing like Emily or me. "Isabella doesn't know about your sister," Ava continued. "She thinks Richard is just living alone in Boston, being a workaholic. She has no idea he's been playing house with someone else." "Playing house," I repeated. "Emily thinks she's his wife. Legally speaking, she's his mistress. A mistress who doesn't even know that's what she is." Over the next few months, Ava shared more details about Isabella's situation. How Richard had swept her off her feet during a business trip to London. How they'd had this whirlwind romance and gotten married within 6 months. How he'd promised to relocate his business to London to be with her, then kept finding excuses to delay the move. Eventually, Richard had stopped visiting altogether. He'd claim business emergencies, family obligations, company crises. Isabella had tried to visit him in Boston, but he'd always have reasons why it wasn't a good time. "She's been living in limbo," Ava explained. "Married but alone, committed to a man who acts like she doesn't exist. She's too proud to chase after him, but too loyal to give up on their marriage." What struck me most was how different Isabella's story was from both mine and Emily's. Richard hadn't fed her corporate restructuring excuses or destiny narratives. He'd simply vanished, leaving her to wonder what she'd done wrong. "Ava," I said one evening, "I think Isabella deserves to know the truth about what her husband has been doing." "I think so too," Ava agreed, "but it should come from someone who understands exactly what Richard Langford is capable of." That's when we started planning. Not revenge exactly, but justice. Isabella deserved to know that her missing husband had been living a completely different life. Emily deserved to know that her perfect marriage was built on fraud. and Richard deserved to face the consequences of thinking he could manipulate three women's lives without any accountability. The plan was simple. Ava would invite Isabella to visit Denver, ostensibly to discuss a potential museum donation. I would share my story with Isabella, and together we'd figure out the best way to expose Richard's lies. What we didn't expect was that Dad's funeral would provide the perfect opportunity for all of Richard's lies to come crashing down in the most public way possible. Isabella arrived in Denver 2 weeks before Dad's funeral, and meeting her was like looking into a mirror of my own pain, but with a completely different reflection. She was even more beautiful in person than in Ava's photos. Tall and graceful with this quiet elegance that seemed effortless. But what struck me most were her eyes. They had the same hollow look I'd seen in my own mirror for months after Richard left me. We met at Ava's apartment on a snowy Thursday evening. Isabella sat across from me in the living room, her hands folded perfectly in her lap, wearing a simple black dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. When she spoke, her British accent gave her words this careful precision. "Ava tells me you were engaged to my husband," she said, and the word husband hit me like a physical blow. "I thought he was a widower," I replied. "He told me his wife had died in a car accident 2 years before we met." Isabella's composure cracked for just a moment. "He told you I was dead." He had this whole story about grief, about not being ready to love again until he met me. He even showed me a photo that he said was taken at your funeral. "What photo?" Isabella asked, her voice getting sharper. I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot I'd saved from Richard's social media years ago. It was a picture of him in a black suit standing in what looked like a cemetery with the caption, "Missing my angel today." Isabella stared at the photo for a long moment, then started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the bitter kind that comes when you realize just how thoroughly you've been played. "That photo was taken at his business partner's funeral in Hartford," she said. "I remember that day because Richard called me from the service, complaining about how boring the eulogy was." We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of Richard's deception. "Tell me about your marriage," I said gently. Isabella's story unfolded like a masterclass in manipulation. Richard had pursued her relentlessly during a business trip to London. He was charming, sophisticated, and completely focused on her in a way that felt intoxicating. Their wedding had been small, but elegant, at a historic church in Mayfair. "He promised we'd split our time between London and Boston," Isabella explained. "Said he was working on opening a European branch of his company. The plan was for me to relocate to Boston within a year." But that year had turned into 2, then 3, then 5. Richard always had excuses. Visa complications, business setbacks, family emergencies. He'd visit London sporadically, staying for a few days before jetting off to another crisis. "I started to feel like a mistress in my own marriage," Isabella said. "He'd show up, we'd have these intense few days together. Then he'd disappear for months." "Did you ever try to visit him in Boston?" I asked. "Once, about 3 years ago. He panicked when I suggested it, said the timing was terrible because of some company merger. He promised we'd plan a proper trip together soon, but somehow that trip never materialized. 3 years ago, right around the time Richard was getting ready to marry Emily." Isabella opened her purse and pulled out a manila folder. "After Ava contacted me, I gathered everything I could find about Richard's life in Boston. Bank records, property documents, business filings." She spread the papers across Ava's coffee table, like evidence in a criminal case. "Because I realized that's exactly what it was." "Look at this," Isabella said, pointing to a bank statement. "Richard's been maintaining 2 completely separate financial lives. He has accounts in London that he uses when he's with me, and accounts in Boston for his American life." "American life with Emily," I added. "According to these property records, he bought the Martha's Vineyard estate 6 months after our wedding. He told me it was a corporate retreat center." Eva leaned over to examine the documents. "Isabella, do you realize what this means legally?" "It means my husband is a bigamist," Isabella said matter-of-factly, "and your sister's marriage is invalid." But Isabella wasn't finished. She pulled out another set of documents that made my blood run cold. "These are divorce papers," she said. "Richard's lawyers have been sending me preliminary divorce documents for 2 years, but they're always missing crucial information or have errors that make them legally meaningless. I think he's been creating the illusion of divorce proceedings without actually following through." "Why would he do that?" I asked. "Because divorce would mean splitting assets," Ava said, understanding immediately. "If he divorced Isabella legitimately, she'd be entitled to half of everything he acquired during their marriage, including the Martha's Vineyard estate where he married your sister." Isabella nodded. "Richard has been having his cake and eating it too. He gets to play the devoted husband when he's in London and the available bachelor when he's in Boston. Meanwhile, I'm stuck in legal limbo, and your sister is unknowingly participating in a felony." "Emily has no idea," I said, and despite everything she'd done to me, I felt a stab of sympathy for her. "None of us had any idea," Isabella replied. "That's what makes Richard so dangerous. He's not just a cheater or a liar. He's a master manipulator who's been orchestrating 3 separate lives without any of us realizing we were sharing the same man." That's when Isabella suggested something that took my breath away. "Claire, I want to meet your sister. I want to see the woman who unknowingly stole my husband, and I think she deserves to know the truth about the man she thinks she married." "When?" I asked. Isabella smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, it was a genuine smile. "Ava mentioned that your father's funeral is next week. Richard will be there, won't he?" "Probably. Emily will want him there for support." "Perfect," Isabella said, closing her folder of evidence with a decisive snap. "Then that's where we'll tell them both the truth, in front of everyone who matters to them." "Isabella," I said carefully, "are you sure you want to do this publicly? It could get messy." She looked at me with those intelligent eyes, and I saw steel underneath the elegant exterior. "Claire, I've spent 5 years being quietly devastated while my husband builds a fantasy life with other women. I think it's time for some loud honesty, don't you? And that brings us back to today, to this moment I've been both dreading and anticipating for the past week. Dad's funeral was scheduled for 2 o'clock at St. Mary's Cathedral, the same church where my parents got married 43 years ago. I'd arrived early, partly to help with arrangements, but mostly because I needed time to prepare myself for seeing Emily and Richard again. Isabella had flown in that morning. She looked absolutely stunning in a tailored black Chanel suit, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. "Are you ready for this?" I asked her as we sat in the front pew. "I've been ready for 5 years," she replied, adjusting her pearl earrings. "The question is whether they're ready for me." At exactly 2:15, Emily made her entrance. And what an entrance it was. She swept through the cathedral doors like she was walking a red carpet, wearing a black designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, despite the fact that this was supposed to be a day of mourning. Richard followed behind her, looking every inch the successful billionaire in his custom-tailored suit. He had his hand possessively on Emily's lower back, guiding her through the crowd of mourners like he owned the place. They worked the room like politicians at a campaign event. Emily would dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while accepting condolences, then immediately brighten when someone complimented her dress or asked about her recent trip to Monaco. I watched this performance from my seat, feeling a mixture of disgust and pity. This was supposed to be Dad's funeral, but Emily had turned it into her own personal showcase. "Is that them?" Isabella whispered beside me. "That's them," I confirmed. Isabella studied Emily with the clinical interest of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. "She's younger than I expected." "She's always been the pretty one," I said. "The charming one." "Charm is just manipulation with better PR," Isabella replied. After the service, we moved to the reception in the church's fellowship hall. It was there that Isabella decided to make her move. She'd positioned herself near the entrance, gracefully accepting condolences from mourners who assumed she was a family friend. Her British accent and obvious sophistication made her an immediate magnet for conversations. Emily, never one to ignore a potential social opportunity, eventually made her way over to Isabella. "I don't think we've met," Emily said, extending her hand with that practiced smile she'd perfected over the years. "I'm Emily Langford Clare's sister." Isabella took Emily's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. "How lovely to meet you, Emily. I'm Isabella." "Are you a friend of my father-in-law's?" Emily asked, assuming Isabella was connected to Dad's business circle. "Not exactly," Isabella replied, her voice carrying that crisp British precision. "I'm actually here because of your husband." Emily's smile widened, probably thinking Isabella was a business associate of Richard's. "Oh, how wonderful. Richard has so many colleagues. What company are you with?" "I'm not with a company," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "I'm with your husband's wife." Emily blinked confusion, replacing her practiced charm. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Isabella's smile was perfectly polite, perfectly controlled, and absolutely devastating. "You must be the mistress." The words hit the reception, like a bomb going off in a library. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even the elderly church ladies stopped arranging casseroles to stare. Emily's face went through a spectacular range of expressions. Confusion, then realization, then horror, then fury. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you must be the mistress," Isabella repeated, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. "Though I suppose you didn't know that's what you were. How could you? Richard is very good at keeping his various women from finding out about each other." That's when Richard appeared, pushing through the crowd like a man running toward a fire he desperately needed to put out. His face had gone completely white, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Isabella," he said, his voice cracking on her name. "What are you doing here?" "Attending a funeral, darling," Isabella replied, her endearment dripping with sarcasm, "though I'm starting to think we should make it a double funeral. One for Claire's father and one for our marriage." Emily was staring back and forth between Isabella and Richard, like she was watching a tennis match in slow motion. "Richard, who is this woman?" "This woman," Isabella said before Richard could answer, "is Isabella Whitmore Langford, your husband's legal wife of 8 years." The silence in that room was so complete, you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Every single person was staring at our little drama triangle, and I realized that Emily's worst nightmare was coming true. She was being publicly humiliated at a social event, exactly the kind of thing she'd spent her whole life trying to avoid. "That's impossible," Emily whispered, but her voice carried in the silence. "We're married. We had a ceremony. I have a marriage certificate." "You have a piece of paper that isn't worth the ink it's printed on," Isabella replied, "because my husband was already married when he went through that lovely little ceremony with you." Richard finally found his voice. "Isabella, this isn't the time or place for this conversation." "Isn't it?" Isabella turned those intelligent eyes on him, and I saw Richard actually take a step backward. "Because I think a funeral is the perfect place to bury lies, don't you?" Emily grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit. "Tell her she's wrong, Richard. Tell her we're really married." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, like a fish gasping for air. No words came out. That's when Isabella delivered the final blow. "Emily, dear," she said, her voice almost gentle now, "I have the marriage certificate from our wedding 8 years ago. I have bank records showing joint accounts that are still active. I have correspondence from Richard's lawyers attempting to initiate divorce proceedings that have been mysteriously stalled for 2 years." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, the same folder she'd shown me in Denver, now serving as evidence in the court of public opinion. "I have proof that Richard Langford has been living as a bigamist for 3 years," Isabella continued, "which makes your marriage invalid and makes you, legally speaking, nothing more than an expensive mistress." Emily's legs gave out. She actually collapsed into a nearby chair, her face white as her wedding dress had been 3 years ago. And Richard did what he'd always done when confronted with the consequences of his actions. He ran, without a word to Emily, without a glance at Isabella, without even acknowledging the room full of people who'd just witnessed his complete and utter destruction. Richard Langford turned and walked out of that reception hall. He left Emily sitting there surrounded by 100 people who now knew that her fairy tale marriage was nothing but an elaborate fraud. The reception dissolved into chaos after Richard's dramatic exit. Guests were whispering. Frantically, phones were coming out to capture what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about social scandal in Boston's recent memory. But I found myself drawn to the small side room where Emily had retreated, probably to compose herself away from the crowd of witnesses to her humiliation. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching my sister fall apart in a way I'd never seen before. Her perfect makeup was streaked with tears, her designer dress wrinkled from where she'd been gripping the fabric. She looked like a broken doll, beautiful, but utterly destroyed. He promised, she was saying to no one in particular, her voice hoarse from crying. He promised he would divorce her. He said it was just a matter of paperwork that she lived in London and didn't matter anymore. He said I was his real wife, his true love. Despite everything she'd done to me, despite the betrayal and the stolen life, I felt a stab of sympathy for her. Emily had always been selfish, always been manipulative, but she'd also been genuinely convinced that she was Richard's chosen one. "Emily," I said, softly, stepping into the room. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Claire, I didn't know, I swear I didn't know he was still married. He told me she was out of the picture, that they were separated and just finalizing the divorce." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. Emily was many things, but she wasn't stupid enough to knowingly enter into a bigamous marriage. "He's gone," she whispered. "Richard just left me there, in front of everyone. He didn't even try to explain or defend me or anything. He just ran." I sat down beside her on the small couch, something I hadn't done in 5 years. "Emily, what did you think would happen when the truth came out?" "I thought we'd figure it out together," she said, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I thought he loved me enough to fight for us, but he looked at me like I was just another problem to be solved, and when he couldn't solve it, he abandoned me." Over the next few weeks, the full scope of Emily's situation became clear. Isabella had wasted no time in filing charges against Richard for bigamy. The case made headlines not just in Boston, but internationally, as Richard's tech empire began to crumble under the weight of the scandal. Emily discovered that everything she thought she owned was actually in Richard's name only. The penthouse apartment, the cars, the vacation homes, even the credit cards she'd been using. Legally, she had no claim to any of it, because their marriage had never been valid. Richard had disappeared completely. Some rumors said he'd fled to a non-extradition country. Others claimed he was hiding out in a private compound somewhere in South America. His lawyers issued a statement saying he was seeking treatment for personal issues and would not be making any public comments. Meanwhile, Isabella was methodically dismantling the financial empire Richard had built during their marriage. As his legal wife, she had legitimate claims to assets he'd acquired over the past 8 years. The Martha's Vineyard estate, where Emily had thought she'd gotten married, Isabella sold it within a month. "I don't want to live in a house where my husband married his mistress," Isabella told me during one of our phone conversations. "Some things are too tainted to keep." Emily had to move back in with our parents sleeping in her childhood bedroom at 33 years old. The social circle that had once envied her glamorous lifestyle now whispered about her behind her back. The charity boards where she'd held prominent positions quietly asked for her resignation. But perhaps the most devastating blow was the realization that her entire identity for the past 3 years had been built on a lie. She'd defined herself as Mrs. Richard Langford, the billionaire's wife, the woman who'd won the ultimate prize. Without that identity, she didn't know who she was anymore. I found myself in an unexpected position. Instead of feeling vindicated by Emily's downfall, I felt hollow. For 5 years, I'd carried the pain of her betrayal, the anger at her theft of my life. But watching her lose everything didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. "I'm sorry," Emily said to me one evening about a month after the funeral. We were sitting in Mom's kitchen drinking coffee and trying to figure out how to be sisters again. "For what specifically?" I asked. "For all of it. For taking Richard, for believing his lies about you not being right for him, for letting him convince me that I was somehow saving him from a mistake, for not telling you when we started seeing each other, for getting married without inviting you, for letting our family be torn apart because I was too selfish to see past what I wanted." It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. "Emily," I said, "I need you to understand something. I forgive you, but I don't trust you, and I don't know if I ever will again." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know. I don't blame you. I just hope someday we can find a way back to being family." 6 months later, I was back in Denver, standing in my office at the museum looking out at the Rocky Mountains. Isabella had called to tell me that Richard had finally been arrested trying to board a private jet in Monaco. He'd be extradited to face charges for bigamy fraud and a whole list of financial crimes that had come to light during the investigation. "Justice," Isabella had said. "Finally." But as I hung up the phone, I realized that justice wasn't what had healed me. It wasn't Richard's arrest, or Emily's downfall, or even the vindication of knowing I'd been right to feel wronged. What had healed me was the simple act of living my own life, building my own success, and discovering that I didn't need anyone else's validation to be whole. That evening, I called Mom to check on how Emily was doing. She'd started working at a local nonprofit, helping women who'd been victims of domestic abuse. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly wasn't the high society lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, but it was real. "She's different now," Mom told me. "Quieter, more thoughtful. She asked me to give you a message." "What's that?" "She said to tell you that she finally understands what you meant about not needing anyone's permission to be happy." That night, I stood in my apartment in Denver looking at the framed photo of Dad that I'd brought back from Boston. He was smiling in the picture, wearing his old construction hat, proud of the business he'd built with his own hands. "Dad," I whispered to the photo, "I didn't need revenge. The truth did it for me." And for the first time in 5 years, I felt completely genuinely at peace. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just living well and letting the truth speak for itself. Because the truth, as I'd learned, has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. And when it does, it's more powerful than any revenge you could ever plan. What do you think about Claire's choice to let the truth speak for itself instead of seeking revenge? Have you ever been in a situation where someone close to you betrayed your trust? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more dramatic tales that prove truth really is stranger than fiction.